Hello and welcome back to World 360. You may recall that in May last year, a gruesome discovery was made in the Canadian province of British Columbia. Bodies of approximately 215 unidentified children were found on the grounds of what used to be one of Canada's biggest residential schools, the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Now, Kamloops was one of the many institutions that were part of Canada's residential school system, which operated from the 1880s to the late 1990s. The system was set up by the Canadian government and administered by Catholic churches to assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian society. Referred to as cultural genocide, these Indigenous children were forcibly separated from their families in order to assimilate them into the Western culture and Christian ways of living. They were forbidden to acknowledge their Indigenous heritage and culture or to even speak their own languages. The children were subjected to physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse. Their education at these schools mainly relied on prayer, manual labor, light industry like woodworking, and domestic work. More than 1.5 lakh children were forced to attend these schools. Now, the excavation of the bodies of many of these children last year shook Canadians and people around the world. Canadian PM Justin Trudeau addressed the issue shortly after the discovery, saying, "Sadly, this is not an exception or an isolated incident. We're not going to hide from that. We have to acknowledge the truth. Residential schools were a reality, a tragedy that existed here in our country, and we have to own up to it." Now, the Indigenous people in Canada are those whose ancestors were the original inhabitants of the country. This included peoples of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. A month after the discovery at Kamloops, hundreds of more graves were found at another residential school in Saskatchewan province. This time, the remains of at least 751 people, mostly Indigenous children, were unearthed. What's important to remember is that these schools were run by churches, which took cues from the Roman Catholic Church. The atrocities committed, however, were never publicly acknowledged until now. In a historic move last week, Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church and the sovereign of the Vatican City state, apologized for the abuses committed at residential schools across Canada for decades. "I feel shame for the role that a number of Catholics with educational responsibilities have had in the abuse and lack of respect for the identity, culture, and spiritual values of the Indigenous peoples in Canada. All these things are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ," he said. Mary Simon, the Governor General of Canada, who herself has Indigenous roots, acknowledged the apology, adding that she hoped it would be backed by action. In her statement, she alluded that the Pope himself was slated to visit the Indigenous lands in Canada. Reports say that this visit is likely to take place in July this year. Not only was the residential school system a tool in a broader plan of colonization of Indigenous peoples and territories in Canada, it also sheds light on the Catholic Church's tainted history, especially when it comes to the treatment of children. You may remember a film in 2015 called Spotlight about journalists at the Boston Globe who investigated cases of widespread and systematic child sex abuse in the Boston area by numerous Roman Catholic priests. The film opened a larger can of worms about the systematic pedophilia and subsequent cover-ups by Roman Catholic priests across the US. In February 2019, Pope Francis publicly acknowledged the systemic maltreatment and set up a system of tribunals designed to make bishops accountable for the priests under them. It was around the same time, in early 2019, when the Catholic Church had a reckoning from the Me Too movement. This time, it was beyond just the US and Canada. In countries like India too, it was discovered that there is systematic sexual abuse of nuns by priests and bishops. Former Bishop Franco Mulakal in Kerala, in the Jalandhar diocese, became the face of the scandal in India. He was accused of sexually abusing a nun 13 times over the course of 2 years, from 2014 to 2016. However, a shock judgment by a sessions court in Kottayam in January this year acquitted Franco, which was widely seen as a face-saving result not just for him, but the Catholic Church too. Now, before we conclude, let's return to Pope Francis's apology to the Indigenous people in Canada. According to Gerald Antoine, who had led the Indigenous people's delegation to Rome to meet the Pope, the next step is to get the Church to admit the role in the doctrine of discovery. In the 1400s, the church provided the doctrine as a framework for Christian explorers in the name of their king or sovereign to lay claim to territories uninhabited by Christians. In short, it was this doctrine that justified much of colonialism, imperialism, and even subsequent genocide in the world. Thanks for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint. Do subscribe to ThePrint and follow us on social media.